which has been updated. You'll find over 150 resources relating to email. These could be anything from state policy statements to assessments of tools, reports, other materials that anyone grappling with email issues will find incredibly useful. And finally, just wanted to draw all of your attention to the COSA Prepare grant. And Prepare stands for Preparing Archives for Records in Email. And this grant-funded project will support a needs assessment, thanks to everybody who completed the needs assessment questionnaire that went out a few months ago. The development of best practice documents relating to accessioning, transfer, and preservation of email, application tool and protocols testing, some technical assistance and mentoring. So if you're not quite comfortable with email, I don't think anyone really fully is at this point, but if you're just starting out, there will be venues for connecting you to other states and territories that are a little further along in the process. And finally, deepening communities of practice so that we as a group are more comfortable dealing with email. Next slide, please. Just to let you all know, last year we talked a lot about the quote unquote video series that we were preparing thanks to the pandemic and some technical issues. We were a little late in getting these materials out, but the videos are now coming fast and furious. And you will find all of these videos, anything from, key concepts in digital processing to advocating, making your case for getting your state or territory to deal with electronic records, file formats. I can tell you that in the works, there are videos relating to copyright and other issues, and more videos are coming soon. Next slide, please. Okay, and just a reminder, the 2021 sponsor of SERI is Preservica. Preservica's support makes this webinar series and a lot of other things possible. So thanks to Preservica. Next slide. And getting down to the business of hand. Greg Wiedemann is the University Archivist in the M.E. Grenander Department of Special Collections and Archives at the University at Albany, State University of New York, where he helps to ensure excuse me, long-term access to the school's public records. He oversees collecting, processing, and reference services for the university archives and supports Born Digital collecting, web archives, and systems implementation for the department's outside collecting areas. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Greg.
Thank you, Bonnie. So thank you for that introduction. Like she said, I'm Greg Wiedemann, and I'm the PI for the Mailbag project. So that's what I'm sort of here to talk about today. And I'll give you like a quick overview, then I'll talk about what we're going to sort of cover today. The main sort of target of the Mailbag project is that there's no real single preservation format for email. Every sort of format has some sort of limitation. So to sort of meet that challenge, we are developing an open specification and then an open source tool. We have two major deliverables as part of this project. And minimally, this will enable users to preserve email archives over IMAP or other common export formats, and hopefully enable like pretty basic near to capture processing. So like we can easily capture email, get it stable, and make it like minimally accessible or like work with it in some ways. So before we get started, I'll throw some of these in the chat. The Mailbag website. Probably do it if I don't do full screen. I can probably just do it at once. That are useful. Folks, yeah, you can download these slides from that final URL as well. So sort of this is the pace of this webinar. One, we'll do some like basic self-assessment, like where we are collectively as a group, because I'm like really intrigued because we're doing a presentation with COSA because you all are sort of really grappling with email from my understanding, at least more of a more immediate need than a lot of like colleges and universities necessarily, because you're working with public records. So I'm really interested to see like where the group is at with email archives. Next, I'll do a little like overview of the origin of the project. So like where this sort of idea came from and what were we doing when we sort of started tinkering with this, and then the preservation issues with email that we sort of stumbled upon in working with email. And then like this like sort of niche of this project, like what we wanted to do, what role we thought it would be possible and feasible to do. Then I'll talk about like sort of how we envisioned the grant and what the process was like and how we designed it. So I feel like that in some respects is more interesting and like less talked about than the technical aspects of it. Then I'll overview both our specification, like process of developing the mailbag specification, and some of the sort of characteristics of what a mailbag will look like. I'll talk about our community feedback process, how we got feedback from the community and how we're continuing to get feedback from the community. We are now working on tool development, starting for about a month, over the last month or so. So I will overview where we are with that, talk about some next steps, and then we'll finally hopefully have a lot of questions for Q&A. Not totally sure about how the pace is going to work because I haven't sort of laid this out yet. I haven't done this before. So I'm assuming we'll do Q&A at the end. If it starts really, if I go through it super fast, maybe I'll try to open it up in the middle. We use Zoom to have that sort of flexibility, but there's a lot I realized that I should cover, so we'll probably put a lot of that to the end. But feel free if you have any questions, like throw them in the chat, and I'll try to address them as they come up. So first, I wanted to do a quick self-assessment just to see like where we're at. So if you go to this, I have to set it up and activate it. This email archive self-assessment. So if you go to this poll EV, it's unfortunately my full name. I'll throw it in the chat too. You can answer this like basic question about email archives, and we can see it come up in the screen. See if I can like keep this while I keep this up. Yeah, so if you can go to that pollev.com/Greg Wiedemann445. It did not give it a link, so I will try this. Not sure if that was going to just people in the waiting room, if not everyone. So there's a link that you can actually click on. It will come up and it will give you this sort of question. My repository has appraised email, just appraised email. We've acquired some email. We've described some email, actually gotten to process and work with email, or at the last stage, sort of, it's like providing access to email. So if you sort of click these out, we can sort of see where we're all at. I'll give it a second to see how these all come up. Yeah, so it looks, that's kind of interesting. It looks like we have some, the biggest in acquired and appraised, less so with process and described, but still some, and we still don't have any that's providing access to email, which is kind of a pretty, we have some that are providing access to email now coming up. So it's maybe not as like unmatched of a challenge. But I think that provides a really interesting picture of sort of where the group is at, which is great. There's another question. So you can go, so this is just sort of an email archive. So this is like single words you can throw in, or if you throw in a bunch of words, it'll just make a, makes sort of like a word cloud. So if you throw any like words in there, what do you think of when you think of email archives? And this will sort of come up. And this is kind of interesting. Complicated is coming up the most. Yeah, lower access is interesting if that's supposed to be the same phrase. Complicated is still the biggest word, which is definitely shows that it sort of remains like a major challenge in archives. PII I'm seeing in there. That's definitely right, one of the more complicated parts of email archives. So I'll go on to the last one. So this is just sort of like a general major challenges here. So it's like an unstructured text field, so you can like throw in a phrase or a sentence, or like major challenges your repositories is experiencing with email. Yeah, staffing, technology, access problem. Definitely getting creators to sort of see this value. There can be a lot of email. And it also takes a lot of like humans and like people to work. It's like a big labor challenge working with email. So you see that coming up a lot. Yeah, with the processing at scale. Yeah, that's sort of the theme. Complicated, labor intensive, takes a lot of time. There's a lot of it. Takes a lot of us to manage it and screen for PII or confidential information, and providing access. These are sort of the big barriers that I'm seeing come up. Okay, so I'll switch back to my slides now. Sorry for jumping around. So I'll talk about sort of the origin of this project and how we started working on it, as you all may. So we started a sort of a pilot project in 2016 before that election cycle. So one of our outside collecting areas in our repository is New York State politics. So we have the state archives, which actually documents like the government of New York State. But we, since Albany is this political capital of New York, we try to document like major policy and interest groups, like activist groups, any organization that's sort of actively campaigning or pushing for any sort of political view or agenda, we try to document. Or politicians' papers as well, we have a lot of. So we were asking, like, how do we document elections in New York? And so we did this sort of pilot project that we were sort of was experiment. Like, we wanted to collect one thing we collect is fundraising emails. So at first, we have a lot of state level candidates. I'm sure in many other states, there's also a lot of candidates. I think there's 150 people in the assembly, and I think 60 something in the Senate, or it might be 60. So it was pretty big. So we just started from our federal level candidates just to start collecting their fundraising emails. So all we did was make a dummy Gmail account, and we had a student go in through and sign up for all of their email responses on candidate websites. I learned a lot about candidate websites. A lot of them break, especially at the state level. But anyway, yeah, it's like their forms don't work. But anyway, so we gathered them in the Gmail account over the course of an election cycle, and then we just got an inbox file that we exported from our at the end of the process. And we downloaded it, threw it in our sort of repository workflow as sort of a SIP. So it was just sitting on a network share in our sort of environment that we use for things that are like unprocessed, basically. We did it again in 2016, and we expanded a lot at the state level. We targeted a lot of those Senate and Assembly candidates, and also the governor's race, because we had a governor's race in New York State in 2018. But again, we just got an inbox file, and it kind of sat there for a couple months. And then we have an inbox file. So now what? And an inbox file is great in that it's open and structured, but we tried processing them in early 2019. So the 2016 one sat for a little while. We developed some Python scripts to extract the HTML. So each email is often like HTML, just like a web page. They can have just text or an HTML. And so we extracted all the HTML out so we can actually like view it. And we used another script to convert it with this tool to PDF files. So that seemed, we were pretty like happy and confident with that. We got stuff like this. And this is an example I love to use, because this one was from Joe Crowley, talking about how he's sort of a rising star with a Democrat in the Democratic Party, like literally weeks before he would lose his primary to AOC, which was interesting. So we got some great full document emails that worked pretty well. And then we got things like this. This is an email from Chuck Schumer, and there's some sort of image there that we have no idea what it was, and it's just a 404. So that image was hosted on an external server, so it wasn't actually included in the MBOX file. So email exports like PST or MBOX files don't actually really contain all the information in an email account. Images and CSS, so like how an email message looks, can also be hosted on external servers. And email CSS can even be interactive. Like you can have like hoverovers and things like that in an email. There's also links to other web content, and yeah, that we wouldn't necessarily expect that to be in our email inbox, whether or not they might be in the actual email messages, whether or not we might want to collect them or they're useful. But we discovered that like the email marketing software or the sort of political sort of like grassroots political campaigns, like software that these candidates were using, was obfuscating the URL. So like if you see that image was this big URL at the bottom. No, I think this URL was actually the link. So in that Joel Crowder email, they linked to a news article. So even though that image was embedded, that link, we don't know where it was on the web, just because we have this redirect that was sort of tracking who clicked on this email link. So, and this email, once we started processing it a couple months later, was a 404. So we didn't really have it, that information sort of was lost. So what we sort of concluded that even if you get an inbox file, which is a pretty good export of email, it rapidly degrades over time. So even if you go to process it like a couple months later, like we do for many things, it will be like rapidly degraded, which is a kind of a pretty like big challenge, we thought, for processing these. So what we sort of discovered is that we have these raw email exports, right? There's open ones, MBOX, and email. Proprietary ones, which are Microsoft PST or MSGs, these are the most common ones. They preserve emails pretty well as structured data, but they don't always include all the data that we need, and also can decay rapidly as all of these URLs progressively become lost on the web. There's also PDF files. PDF files are often a part of email workflows. It preserves email really well as a visual document, and they're really easy to use. You can email someone a PDF file and they can open it, but usually. But it does not really structure the data well for computational use. So for users that ever want to use PDF files at scale for any reason, it's really hard to extract the data out and use it for like distance reading or any sort of computational use, because it doesn't really structure the data, and PDF files are kind of messy from a technical perspective. So it's really hard to utilize like them as data. So another file we were really intrigued by using with our work files, and work files it's an ISO standard normally created during web archiving. And it preserves the visual document experience of email pretty well, just because HTML is it's just like a web archive. Emails contain HTML, and it also preserves and maintains the data structure of HTML. So it has the potential of solving both problems, but work files are still, they've made a lot of progress, but it's still hard to use, right? It's still, if I email a lot of people a work file, a lot of people are not going to be able to use them and open them. And there's still also a lot of like really low support. No one's really using work files for email. So we're more intrigued to that as a possibility than like a catch-all, but it has a lot of potential. So what we sort of decided is let's use multiple formats, and importantly, multiple preservation formats. So normally when we use multiple formats in archives, we're talking about preservation and access formats, right? You can always sort of that idea of the OAIS model that you can always regenerate your access formats from your preservation copies. So in this case, we can't really generate. So if we have an MBOX and PDFs, the idea is that these are both preservation formats because they both contain different affordances for net preserving email. So we can't really regenerate the PDFs from the MBOX files because, again, a lot of that data will be lost. So using multiple email formats, we think solves a lot of that problem. So, we think that you might use different options for different use cases. You might want Mbox PDFs and works for the same email. You might just want a Mbox and a bunch of PDFs. That might just solve your problem. You might have a PST files that you don't really trust to maintain long term. So you might want PST emails and works. So I think a lot of different repositories will have different needs in this regard. And the other challenge is like, how do we maintain the relationship between these messages in these different formats? So like, try to preserve the actionability of this email. So right now we can like open an Mbox file and like iterate through it and like look through all like computationally if you write a script. We want to be able to in the future look through that Mbox file or that email, and also if it has a different version of it, have a PDF for that file and like work with that too. So to make that connection automatically between the two, to maintain that relationship in a structured way. So we looked around, and the Bagot specification is widely used in digital preservation, and it has a really flexible structure. It's super open, and it's really useful. And it also provides fixity, and it has Bagot Python is a widely utilized library for managing and creating Bagot bags. So that seems to be a really good fit to sort of extend Bagot Python. So that's what I'm thinking. What I'm thinking of as the mailbag niche, sort of like this sort of really good window for a project that we thought that we could do something that really could provide the next step in processing and making available email archives, but doesn't necessarily solve all of our email problems. And that is to provide a common specification to provide this structure for preserving email using these multiple preservation formats. So instead of your single preservation format, you would have a mailbag that would include multiple formats for each of those email. And also a basic open source utility, sort of an extension of Bagot Python that will enable us to easily create and manage mailbags minimally. Like it might not do every part of your workflow, just like Bagot Python doesn't necessarily like do every part of your Born Digital processing workflow, but it will create and manage your mailbags minimally. Sort of like you can use other tools around it because it's so open. So sort of that's how we were sort of thinking. So, and I want to be upfront about this. Sort of where this project is aiming to solve technical challenges. It preserves email so it won't degrade if you actively manage it over time, which is like a really, I think, a really important challenge to solve. And it makes acquisition processing and just basic access, if you just want basic PDF access, easier to do. But it does not solve a lot of the human challenges that we're still having with email archives. A lot of the issues that came in that self-assessment, right, were really human challenges. Like we don't have the staffing, it's really labor intensive to identify personal PII or issues with privacy concerns. There's also a lot of legal risks aversion. A lot of organizations might not have great records management. A lot of them may not necessarily, the email might not get transferred to the archive in the first place. These are like actually much harder problems to solve and really require people that aren't really going to be solved with are not really going to have technical solutions. So I feel in some cases we're taking the easy way out. We're going to solve the easier technical problem and not these bigger sort of structural challenges. But we can hope that by making it easier to acquire, process, and provide access to email, that we can make email archives more visible, which might sort of structurally help a little bit more of those challenges. But sort of that's the best we got. But I would really want to be upfront of that. We're solving the technical challenges, but like there's still like a lot of challenges with working with email. So one of the things that we thought that this way, which just made us go ahead with this project, is we thought that it was really feasible. We had an existing proof of concept. We had some Python scripts that were a little wonky, but kind of worked minerally. And we could do this sort of one thing. So, and this follows this idea in technology, this separation of concerns principle. Instead of having one big thing that tries to do so many different things, instead be open and do one thing really well. And then it can be easy to use and do one thing well, and then you can use other tools sort of around that. We also wanted to be inclusive to allow the most possible archivists to use. So a lot of software is challenging for small repositories to use and support. And we're also using archivists in a really broad sense here. We hope that also not just academic archivists or archivists working in state archives can use this to manage email, but also just everyday people who just want to preserve their Gmail account can, if they're a little technical, hopefully use Mailbag to just package it in a way that makes them some PDFs so that they can really actively manage it on their computer a little bit easier than just getting that inbox file. So we really want, like, we're really envisioning broad, like low level use. We don't want something big and complicated. We want something as simple as possible. So this is sort of where I sort of was writing out. We don't think Mailbag will solve all of your email problems, but it will do a very good job at solving some of the email problems with email archives. I think there's like an idiom or a better phrase for that, but I couldn't think of it. But that's sort of, I think, a good summary of that. This like niche that we think, the project can fit. So I'll talk about how we're sort of designing the grant. So this sort of happened when we were sort of recognizing these challenges. We discovered that the University of Illinois had this email archive building capacity and community program, which is also funding the COSA Prepare project. So it's a UNOS re-grant program from the Mellon Foundation, which was a limit with limit up to $100,000. So we thought that this was a really good fit. Like a tool we were kind of thinking of was building capacity for processing email archives. So we started going around this process, but a lot of this, like how are you designing the grant, questions that usually came up. One of the barriers is that because it was a re-grant program, they don't pay indirect costs. So that's like they would pay to like support our university's like lights and structural things, just like keeping the building open. And also they really were discouraging like buying out time. So they wouldn't buy out my time or any one of our other archivists or technologists' time. So we had to like figure out how we have money, but how do we, if we could get money, how do we actually get something for this done? I think this is a probably experience. This is definitely an experience in public universities, and I'm assuming it's an experience in public archives as well. So paying for stuff is pretty easy, relatively speaking. Paying people to do stuff is actually much harder to get someone to actually do a thing. So we sort of figured out like what assets do we have, and we have really an awesome professional community that's working around these challenges. And we also have some great students at UAlbany that are really working on these and would be excited to work on these challenges. So we started to sort of like stress that in our grant design. And we also wanted to build sustainably. So we wanted this tool to be sustainable. So one of the things is we wanted to really keep the long-term maintenance of it in mind as we were sort of initially developing this plan. So we didn't really think that there was a vendor that we could just pay to like do this project, because it wouldn't give us a lot of necessarily control over what technology they were using necessarily. Because we wanted something that was open and super simple, and we were willing to actually make the project require a little more work to get that, to ensure that we'd have less long-term maintenance. Because like, again, this is a grant project, so like any grant projects, they have an end and the funding runs out. And another challenge we came across is that our students have diverse experience. They have a lot of skills, so we were able to find graduate students that can do a lot of this work, but a lot of their skills comes from different contexts. So it wasn't like something that we can say, here, hire some students, here's this project, like go at it and come back with us when you're done. Like it wasn't something like that. All of our students sort of might have experience developing projects, but in working on web applications, where this is a desktop application, working on completely different tool sets. So they have similar skills, but they really had to learn how to do a lot of this work too. So what we ended up doing is we developed an advisory board of community experts. So these are other people typically working at other university archives or that have hands-on experience, hopefully working with email. So a lot of times grant projects, the advisory board is more of like high-level people with a lot of experience in the field. We actually wanted like people with like less experience necessarily, but more hands-on experience. We were really thinking about people who actually knew what it was like to work with email, that could actually give us feedback. Is our tool really helping them? We also wanted to bake in like learning as part of this work. So we, in addition to the 2 graduate students that we hired for this project, we outlined a more experienced developer to hire as a consultant who's worked on similar projects. But instead of, he would come to outline the sort of structure and the architecture of the tool and the framework for it. And the students can sort of plug in each of the different functionalities. So they weren't sort of starting from scratch. And the structure was like designed by an experienced developer, so it could be more maintainable, we hope. We also, one of the things that we came up with was to hire, instead of hiring one graduate student for a lot of time, we're hiring with two graduate students, because we didn't want the experience of one student trying to learn and keep getting feedback from the graduate developer or from us. That didn't really, like, we didn't expect that to be like a comfortable work environment to like learn, and we expected these students to like be learning on this part of this process. So instead, the idea is what we're going to do is a collaborative code review process. So we're hiring two graduate students, and they're going to review each other's code, so they sort of can learn together, along with me, because this is my first time managing a process like this, and even our consultant developer, this is the first time that he's worked with like graduate students in this way. So we're all sort of learning it at different points. So that's sort of the environment that we're emphasizing in this project. We also want our supporting remote conference attendance for the graduate students, so they can sort of learn and become a part of the community. Another thing we wrote into the grant was honorariums to support community project work. So again, we have this like great community of other archivists working out there on email archive. So we wrote in honorariums to to support people contributing to the specification, writing code reviews for any people who have experience writing code or reviewing it, testing it, and also to write user documentation too. So we have sort of this money that we can support and compensate people for contributing to this project. And then also we built in outreach. So we have some funding at the end to do sort of, and I'll talk more about this at the end, sort of either like a datathon, hackathon, or some workshops at the end. So we can like engage the community to work with the tool. So this is like how the budget played out. Most of the funding is going for the GA student developers. We ended up like how much to make the cost. We ended up just we have a library GA program, and we ended up just doubling the hourly rate and putting it out for the year, and that's what we came up with. Whether that was right or not, I'm not sure, but that's kind of the tool, the benchmark we used. We have 100 hours of the consultant developer. We have some money for community honorariums to pay people again to support different like smaller aspects of the project, some conference supports, marketing, we're gonna get some stickers, that's about it, and some cloud servers that we can sort of hopefully test in sort of a datathon, hackathon, or a workshop when the project's done. So it's not a very big grant project, it's kind of lean. If I had to do this again, I don't think you can ever put enough funding into consultant or like time to pay people, like money to pay people. Like always just bake in, if you can, pay people more or bake in more money to have more hours for people. I don't think we would have ever regretted adding for more money. It's not like we're necessarily hitting limits in that. It's just like I've learned over the course of this that you could always need more time from people. And also I sort of underestimated like just the time to administer this grant, not just from me, but from the folks at Illinois, our grants folks at UAlbany, Illinois grants folks, just to get this sort of the back and forth to like get this project through. And even like hiring students to work remotely when every campus is pushing back to on-campus work was an interesting challenge to solve. And things like that kept coming up that just takes like a lot of time to sort of administer that I sort of underestimated as part of this project. So that's sort of things that we came across that we didn't expect when we outlined this. So next I'll talk about our sort of specification development. So the idea is to have an open specification that was independent from the tool itself. So even though our tool, we don't have a ton of resources, we might only do one or two like things we only want to create and like report out and create PDF files for email archives and create mailbags, but potentially someone might come out with more funding or more resources and want to do different things. So we wanted the specification to be entirely independent from the mailbag tool to allow for these additional implementations. And that we hope that promotes interoperability between tools. So if we have this sort of specification that different tools can meet, and if different tools are meeting the same specification, hopefully that promotes interoperability between them so you can use each of these different tools. So we altered our original plan. We originally had honorary to support like 1 or 2 people to like contribute to writing some of this. And we realized that was going to be like a major ask to just like take someone, even like if they were like an expert, and just pop them in and say, here, write the specification and come back to us when we're done. We realized that we couldn't really do that. It wasn't going to be successful. So we sort of, the project team, me and my colleague Mark Wolf, wrote the initial like first draft of the specification. It was really rough. And then we sent it out to our advisory board and got some initial feedback from them, reworked it. And then we did a 2-hour sort of specification working meeting. So we had an open call for participants, and we gave them a $200 honorarium for attending. And they that was to compensate them from their time to really dive in and spend the time working with the standard, and also spend that 2 hours doing these collaborative exercises that we sort of threw at them to sort of test out how the mailbag specification was going to work. It was successful in some ways and not others. It was successful in that we got great feedback from them that was really useful, that we were able to update the specification. We realized very quickly that we weren't going to get to all the exercises. We hadn't done a lot of these exercises yet in this context. So it kind of got rushed a bit. So it worked well for us, but I think it wasn't a great experience for the people, the participants, that I wish could have been better. So I think that I would have done a little bit different and like try to do less, or figured out a way to do to put more time into it. So this is sort of what we came up to. If you're familiar, if you're familiar with a Bagot bag, it's basically a Bagot bag with some other things attached to it. So at the top, I'll sort of we have, hopefully that's big enough to see. You have your Bagot.txt, your baginfo.txt, and your manifests that have your checksums. And then there's a data directory. And these are just folders and text files on your file system. So you can go in and open them up, edit them, work with them. And in that, so what the mailbag specification does is just to prescribe certain folders in the data directory, which is also called the payload in Bagot parlance. And it names these folders Mbox, PDF, and Warp, and that's where those versions of those emails would go. And there's also a MAILBAG.CSV file up top as part of the tag files, and that is to sort of make these connections between them with unique identifiers. So computationally, you can take your EML or Mbox instance of an email message and automatically connect it to a PDF of the same kind, whether that's through the file name and or the identifier. And the nice thing about a CSV is you could also like just double click it and open it up in Microsoft Excel too, is one of the reasons that we went with that option. It also has an attachments directory, which is optional. And for our implementation, we're going to pull out, so if you give it an Mbox file, it will also pull out all the attachments, so you can actually see them in a directory and browse through them. So diving more detail into the data directory or the payloads, this is what a mailbag might look like. You might have your Mbox file, and this is the file name that Gmail gives you when you do an export, one of them, all mail, including spam and trash. So you can have that Mbox file, and then in the PDF directory, you can have a pile of PDFs for each message. In the work directory, you can have a pile of works for each messages, and each of those attachments using the same identifiers, you can connect them to what, if there was images or other things that were attached to those messages. If you have an email folder structure, you can just put that in these subdirectories essentially. So if you have inbox or sent mail or any trash or anything like that, these just get in those directories. And these again are just folders on your file system, so you can just click through them and view them, which is the really nice thing about Bagot, and we hope MailBag it. We also recommend support original file naming. So if you have EML files or MSG files that are single files for each email messages, they have to be named something. So instead of the identifiers, we just carry over that name, essentially. We thought that was more useful. So it also has a baginfo.txt file. So this is the metadata file usually that's included in a bag. And so this file has a lot of technical and provenance metadata. So it tells what the source of this email was, whether the original export file was included. So you could tell if that original PST or Mbox file was the actual one, or was it modified during the creation of the mailbag. what tool created the mailbag, a version number, dates, what tools were used to like use the different derivative formats. So like if you created a bunch of PDFs, what tool was used to create them, what version of it. So you can sort of track what sort of happened to this. And the hope of this is that this could map to premise. If you wanted to like make a full premise record out of this later on, you could. This is the mailbag.CSV file. So you have those identifiers that I'll talk about a bit more, and where the messages are in the folder structure, and also the email header information. So these are also in the mbox or EML files if you use them, but we also optionally, you can also include them in the CSV. So if you make an mbox file, if you make a mailbag, you can just open up the CSV file, and in addition to all the messages, you can get a big table with their the header information as well. It also has support for things that are not retained, which are just text files, whether that's individual message identifiers or like folders. So if you, during creation of a mailbag, didn't include the drafts or the trash folder, it'll document that text file, which we think is, again, useful for provenance. So one of the things that we came across was challenges with identifiers. So email has identifiers embedded in them, right? Message ID. And these are some examples of what they look like. They're usually like the domain of the email and an identifier. But not all of these are file system safe. So we're using these identifiers as like the file name. So if you make a PDF file, that's what it would be. So we decided that that wasn't safe to do in an automated way. So we had to actually, unfortunately, make our own identifier system on top of this. So we also have a field called mailbag message ID, which could be like a sequential number. So you can have email 1 to email 5,000 and something, or like a unique identifier. And that CSV file is used to connect sort of the two. So you would have the message ID and the mailbag message ID. We also found lots of cases where the mbox file does not include the message ID for the email for whatever reason. And again, we try to support the original file names when they are there. So after we did the specification development, after we did the working meeting, we did an open call for feedback on the specification. And also initially, before we started at the beginning of the project, we did an open call for feedback on the design documents. We have some personas that are useful on the Mailbag website, and also use cases and requirements. So these are sort of the people and the sort of that we're thinking of when we're building this tool, and their sort of skills and capabilities that we want to try to meet and needs. And also some use cases and project requirements that we got some feedback on that was pretty helpful. And then we got some really great response for the open call for feedback on the specification. So what we did for that is we just have a Google Doc, because that's really easy for people to interact with. So you can still go up there and comment and make suggestions if you'd like. And also what we did is we pulled out the major feedback we got from the working meeting, the major points that we didn't really reach consensus on. We pulled them out as GitHub issues. So on GitHub, you can also comment there if you have thoughts about our decisions on that. So some things came up in the community feedback that we didn't really reach total consensus on. So one is multiple export files. So if you have a bunch of different PSTs or mbox files. Another is different versions, because for redactions or reading. And the final one was descriptive metadata. I'll talk about the first two in more depth. Descriptive metadata, the idea is that people were thinking because we have a bag, why can't that bag just be our SIP? And I want to have descriptive metadata in it. And that seems very reasonable. But the thing we're kind of thinking about Mailbag as sort of to replace the preservation file format. So just like if you look at that example that I had of the mailbag.txt file, a lot of that mailbag is just technical metadata. So just like you having a TIFF file or an embedded metadata in a file, it can tell you a lot about the origin of the file, but you can put descriptive metadata there, but that might not be the best place to put it, because it doesn't help you make it available to people at scale. So we sort of thought that descriptive metadata is sort of a very different problem in creating and managing it than Mailbag is trying to do. But this was sort of an easy middle ground to find, because you can still put, because Baggett is extensible and we're just building upon Baggett, you can put anything you want in a baginfo.txt when you create this. So you can, even though we don't necessarily recommend it, you can always put descriptive metadata in a Mailbag. So these other points of consideration. One is the multiple email versions, and that's because redaction and weeding are really common, if not ubiquitous, for email archives. But the problem with this is that there's just so many variety of workflows, and we'd only be able to support like a very few simple like processes, and like a lot of different workflows interact with different tools. And again, in the interest of keeping things really simple, we thought this version management was like a very different type of problem that we were trying to tackle, a very important and challenging problem. So our thought was, by not including versioning, we can actually make Mailbag more useful. So instead of only supporting some versioning workflows, we can actually, you can use other tools to manage multiple versions of mailbags and have multiple mailbags. And by doing that, your mailbag can actually work in all of these workflows, even though it won't out of the box. You'll have to use your own tools to do that. And like I mentioned before, you can use multiple mailbags. So you can have like your sort of preservation and then access mailbags. And because there's flexibility in what formats to use, you can you might only want your MBOX and PDF in your preservation copy. And then in your access mailbag, you might only want PDFs, which are the redaction versions. The other case that we sort of talked about a lot is multiple export files. So there's 3 different use cases from this. One is I have a group of export files like MBOX or PST files from multiple email accounts. So I have like an entire office's email exports. Another use case is I have export files from the same account, like exported over time. And the other one was I just have a group of export files that are exported all at one time from the same account, but just because of size reasons, Outlook just split them up into multiple PST files. So what we sort of discovered is that it's really challenging to model multiple MBOX or PST files. It makes the relationships like the one-to-many relationship to a many-to-many. So it's really hard to make sure that we can like handle this. There's potential for duplicate messages, and overall it introduces a lot of complexity into the standard. And we we have very limited resources, and we want this thing to like solve very simple a small amount of problems very well. So we think that this is pretty challenging to do. And there's also, again, little technical cost to managing multiple mailbags. So even if you have all of these different export files, you can make a mailbag for each of them, and you can manage it as a zip file, and then you can put it in a SIP or another bag. And there isn't really a technical cost to that. It is sort of unintuitive, we understand, but sort of what we're sort of conclude is that this is sort of a workflow or file management problem, which is an important like challenge, but not really the problem that we were trying to go back. So to go back to those 3 use cases, so we decided that we're not going to support the use cases where we have lots of different email accounts or the same email accounts over time. You'd have to make multiple, you can do it, but you'd have to make multiple mailbags. We're hoping that we can support the PST or MBOX file that was split for purely technical reasons, that's from the same account. But again, we were sort of waiting till we get further development so we can see if we can make that practical. So in like having this discussion, like some things that I was starting to think about, because of course, like we got such this feedback from potential users. Of course, they're right. This is a really important challenge. And sort of what we sort of talked about in our advisory board is that archivists don't really have good tools to manage board teacher files now. So that's a really big challenge. Like we have a bunch of things, we don't have things that just work for us perfectly. And also that we sort of thinking that we really have to rely on ordinary desktop tools to manage these challenges, because like I talked about before, just the difficult in like supporting a project like this, which isn't even like a big project, but building and supporting and maintaining these tools, workflow tools like this is really challenging. So trying to do this and make it sustainable is like is really hard. And if we can able to use ordinary desktop tools like copy and paste and like access to ordinary files, if we can build our workflows around these desktop tools, they are a better resource, they work a lot better, and they can give us more power and control over our workflows. The downside is that we need more tools that give archivists this control and power, and use desktop file systems over web applications that are easier to support, easier to maintain, and that use these sort of like very more basic tools. And that's sort of the ethos we're trying to work on with the the Mailbag project. So like I said, we've been working on tool development for sort of the past month. The consultant developer, Dave Mayo, outlined the structure in this summer, and our GA developers started working about a month ago. We're using GitHub tools, so you can follow along in issues in the pull request. We have a Kanban board up at the project. And yeah, so any of the functionality that we're building into the tool is being described as an issue. It's getting assigned to one GA developer, and then they're reviewing it as code. And the idea is that, like I sort of explained before, that we can sort of learn collaboratively among this process. And some of the more challenging contributions will also be reviewed by a consultant developer or a community member funded by an honorarium. So next steps, we're going to continue our tool development and hopefully get those real world tests for our specification so we can sort of make sure it works in practice as we think it will. And we hope to have the specification, sort of the initial release of it, by the end of the year. We hope to have some outreach and a minimal working tool in next spring, and hoping to do, we have some funding to do some sort of data-thons that we can also, as a group, get access to some email exports and play with them using the tool, and potentially do some workshops. And again, we hope the tool to be released near the end of the academic calendar year, which is around the time that our grant project concludes. Here's the links again for the Mailbag project website that are in the slides. I guess I'll leave some time for Q&A, and I wanted to thank our project team, the rest of our project team, and our advisory board and our consultant developer.
Okay, Greg, thank you so much. Folks, if you have a question, I believe you're all unmuted, so feel free to unmute your mic and ask. If you're a little more comfortable asking a question in a chat, I will read your question for the sake of the recording. So we'll just give folks a couple of minutes to formulate their questions. Keep an eye on the chat box. And Greg, while we're waiting, I do have one question for you. And I realize that this might require something of a long answer, and we don't have a lot of time. But where do you envision Mailbag and its tool fitting into your institution's workflow?
Yeah, so I think sort of what I was talking about in using like desktop tools, in that we have web applications that we use to provide access to archives, but a lot of the things we're using to build our SIPs and our DIPs and our APEs are just network shares and bags, and like they're more specifications. So because of that, a Mailbag kind of fits in pretty well. We can use Mailbag to just create these packages of emails, and then they fit right into our SIPs that just are on network shares. So we don't necessarily have like web applications we upload them to. We have like a lot of more, like we try to build in that sort of using those ordinary tools in sort of our workflow. So it kind of fits in really well. So, but we also hope that we have these initial Python scripts that we were using at the beginning of the project that were kind of wonky and that were mostly working. So this, we hope, is much more professional job because we actually have developers working on it, and that we can use this tool to like process those, both the New York State political emails that we were working on, as well as our university emails, which we have some of now.
Okay, great. Any questions from anyone else?
So while we're doing this too, I made another poll everywhere. Feel free to unmute and ask a question or put it in the chat too. I will deactivate this. Sort of, if you go to that same link, I'll put it up in the, again, back in the chat box. You can say sort of like whether it meets, you're thinking it meets your needs or not. And we can sort of see. It'd be really disappointing if everything's absolutely no, but it'd be really helpful to sort of see. So you can go in and see the Mailbag specificational tool sort of seems to like on the scale of like exactly or like sort of meet what we're working on or not at all. And we can sort of see, and that would help us like get some feedback on what we're looking for. But again, while this is coming out, feel free to unmute or ask some questions.
Yeah, while we're waiting, one of the things that I'll say is, one of the things I really like about this project is its recognition that we have different needs and that solutions that work for one institution might not work for another. For instance, working in a state archives, I was looking at those emails from Chuck Schumer and the like and thinking, if I were processing the email of a department commissioner and I saw something like that, I wouldn't care about preserving the image because I would, be giving that entire message the boot. It's not really, part of state government's workings. And so for instance, it might be the case that I have email that I really don't care what it looks like in the end, because it's all text, or there might be an image that somebody cut and pasted into a message here and there. But like I said, that's one of the things that I really do like about this project. There may be other state archives that have emails that absolutely have visual content that need to be preserved.
Yeah, I think that's what we're hoping to do, like a broad spectrum, like including work files from that, provides a lot of that potential. But we also want to understand that for state government records, I'm thinking you might need emails, mboxes, and PDFs is might be more go-to. But even having that redundancy, having both an email and a PDF might be much more robust way of preserving email. And being able to do that simply on that end, or you might have there could be email art we were thinking about at some point. That would be really challenging to preserve.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, we've got a minute to wrap this up. I'm sure Greg would be, happy, if you're like me, you'll think of a question 3 minutes after the webinar ends. I'm sure Greg will be happy to entertain questions via email.
Yeah.
And if we could just put the slideshow back up.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not actually seeing the slides, but just wanted to thank you all for attending and encourage you to stay in touch with COSA via the recently redesigned website. It looks great, via Twitter or on our Facebook page. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon.